Good morning again from southeastern Finland in northern Europe. I continue my video series of historical events from selected years. Now it is the turn for 1989. It was known as one of the crazy years of Europe because several Eastern European communist regimes announced democratic reforms, and Eastern Europe began in earnest the process of democratization, with the result that nowadays most Eastern European countries are democratic, although democracy seems to be under threat in two of those countries because of populist right-wing regimes, Poland and Hungary, more specifically. One Eastern European country is still a Soviet-style dictatorship, meaning Belarus or White Russia. One is a mixture of democratic and authoritarian political systems, meaning Russia. 1989 was a so-called common year or 365-day year. Let us look at its events more in detail. In the Gregorian calendar, 1989 started on Sunday. On January the 2nd, 1989, Prime Minister Ranasinghe Predamasa took office as the third president of Sri Lanka. On January the 7th, 1989, the Japanese emperor and nominal head of state Hirohito died. His son Akihito was enthroned as the 125th emperor of Japan, immediately followed by the change in the era name from Showa to Heisei. Akihito abdicated on April the 30th, 2019, and was succeeded by his son Naruhito. On January the 10th, 1989, in accordance with the United Nations Security Council Resolution 626 and the New York Accords, Cuban troops began withdrawing from Angola. On January the 15th, 35 European countries meeting in Vienna, Austria's capital, agreed to strengthen human rights and improve East-West trade. On January the 18th, 1989, the Polish United Workers' Party, or basically the Polish Communist Party, decided to legalize the Solidarity Trade Union. On January the 20th, George Herbert Walker Bush, usually known as just George Bush or George Bush Sr., because his oldest son, George Bush Jr., or George W. Bush, also served as US president later. But the senior or elder Bush became the US president on that day, having defeated decisively his Democratic opponent, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, in the November 1988 US presidential elections. He faced, however, a Democratic majority in both houses of Congress. From January the 23rd to 24th, armed civilian leftists briefly attacked and occupied an Argentinian army base near Buenos Aires. Argentina had been led by a military junta since the overthrow of President Isabel Perón in 1976, but in 1983 democracy had been restored to this South American country. On February the 2nd, 1989, the last Soviet armored column left Kabul, Afghanistan's capital, ending over 9 years of military occupation since December 1979. Satellite television service Sky Television plc was launched in Europe. On February the 3rd, 1989, a military coup overthrew Mr. Alfredo Stroessner, a Paraguayan general and the Paraguayan dictatorial president since 1954. After a stroke, State President of South Africa Peter Willem Botha resigned as leader of the ruling National Party. On February the 5th, 1989, Eurosport, a multiple language sports broadcasting station in Europe, first started to broadcast its service in Issy-les-Moulineaux, Île-de-France, in France. On February the 6th, the communist government of Poland held formal talks with representatives of Solidarity Movement for the first time since 1981. On February the 11th, 1989, Barbara Harris became the first woman consecrated as a bishop of the Episcopal Church in the United States of America. She also became the first woman to serve as a bishop in the worldwide Anglican Communion. The issue of female ordination of priests and bishops has long divided various Protestant churches, although a growing number of Protestant churches, not just the so-called traditional or institutional or mainline churches such as the Episcopalian, Anglican, Lutheran, Reformed, Calvinist, and Methodist ones, ordain women as priests or pastors, but so do a growing number of evangelical free, interdenominational, Pentecostal and charismatic churches as well. On February the 14th, 1989, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the supreme leader of Iran, who would pass away on June the 3rd, 1989, issued a fatwa calling for the death of Indian-born British author Salman Rushdie and his publishers for issuing the novel The Satanic Verses, published in 1988. The first of 24 Global Positioning System, or GPS, satellites was placed into orbit. On February the 15th, 1989, the Soviet Union announced that all of its troops had left Afghanistan. On February the 23rd, 1989, after protracted testimony focusing on personal issues such as an alleged drinking problem and alleged womanizing, the United States Senate Armed Services Committee rejected 11-9 President Bush's nomination of Senator John Tower of Texas for Secretary of Defense. As a part of the so-called Singing Revolution, on February the 24th, celebrated as the Estonian Independence Day, after 44 years, the Estonian flag was raised at the Pikk Hermann, or Tall Hermann Tower in Tallinn, Estonia's capital. At the time, Estonia was still a Soviet Socialist republic. In March 1989, Poland began to liberalize its currency exchange and in a move toward capitalism. On March the 1st, the Berne Convention, an international treaty on copyrights, was ratified by the United States. On March the 3rd, 1989, Mr. Jammu Siltavuori, a Finnish criminal, abducted and murdered two 8-year-old girls in the Myllypuro suburb of Helsinki, the Finnish capital. He would die in a psychiatric hospital in March 2012, at the age of 85. On March the 4th, 1989, Time Incorporated and Warner Communications announced plans for a merger forming Time Warner, now Warner Media. On March the 7th, 1989, Iran broke off diplomatic relations with Britain over Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses. On March the 9th, the Soviet Union submitted to the World Court's jurisdiction. On March the 15th, mass demonstrations were held in Hungary, southeastern Europe, demanding democracy. On April the 1st, 1989, Margaret Thatcher's new local government tax, the poll tax, was introduced in Scotland. It would be introduced in England and Wales in 1990, would result in massive protests, and in the cases of hundreds, perhaps thousands of people, with the deliberate non-payment of taxes, and it would be one of the remote causes for the Caucus Revolt in the autumn of 1990, which led to Margaret Thatcher's resignation in late November 1990, after 11 and a half years as the British Prime Minister. On April the 2nd, in Southwest Africa, now called Namibia, fighting erupted between SWAPO insurgents and the Southwest African police on the day that a ceasefire was supposed to end the South African border war, according to United Nations Security Council Resolution 435. By April the 6th, nearly 300 people were killed. A Finnish diplomat, Mr. Martti Ahtisaari, would be instrumental in brokering the agreement whereby South Africa agreed to fully withdraw from Namibia, with the country becoming an independent republic in 1990. Mr. Ahtisaari would go on to serve as the 10th Finnish president from 1994 to 2000, and would receive the Nobel Peace Prize in 2008. On April the 5th, 1989, the Polish government and the Solidarity Trade Union signed an agreement restoring Solidarity to legal status and agreeing to hold democratic parliamentary elections on June the 4th. On April the 15th, 1989, the death of Hu Yaobang in China sparked the start of the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests in Beijing. The Hillsborough disaster, one of the biggest tragedies of European football, claimed the lives of 96 Liverpool Football Club supporters. In Hillsborough, the football stadium's spectator stands were overcrowded. The crush occurred in the two standing-only central pens in the Leppings Lane stand allocated to Liverpool supporters. Shortly before kickoff, an attempt to ease overcrowding outside the entrance turnstiles, the police match commander, Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield, ordered Exit Gate C opened, leading to an influx of even more supporters to the pens. In the days and weeks following, police fed false stories to the press, suggesting that hooliganism and drunkenness by Liverpool supporters were the disaster's causes. Blaming of Liverpool fans persisted even after the Taylor Report of 1990, which found that the main cause was a failure of control by South Yorkshire police. The disaster also led to a number of safety improvements in the largest English football grounds, notably the elimination of fenced standing terraces in favor of all-seater stadiums in the top two tiers of English football.
Niin Maikkeli
Joo. Joo, tulen pian.
Aamulla ei ole vielä valmis.
Yeah. In May 1989, genetic modification of adult human beings was tried for the first time, a gene tagging trial. The Soviet Union issued its first Visa card in a step to digitalize their banking system. On May the 1st, Andrés Rodríguez, who had seized power and declared himself president of Paraguay during a military coup in February, won a landslide victory at a general election marked by charges of fraud. On May the 2nd, 1989, Hungary dismantled 240 kilometers of barbed wire fencing along the border with Austria. It is an ironic twist that a few years ago, or some years ago, Hungary erected a border wall on its border with Serbia, allegedly to protect the country from thousands of illegal or potentially illegal refugee claimants from the Middle East, most notably Syria and Iraq. On May the 3rd, 1989, the first McDonald's restaurant in the Soviet Union began construction in Moscow, the country's capital, and would open on January the 31st, 1990. On May the 4th, 1989, Colonel Oliver North, who had been a military advisor to President Ronald Reagan, was convicted of charges related to the Iran-Contra affair. His conviction was thrown out on appeal in 1991 because of his immunized testimony. He would go on to be the Republican candidate for US Senate in the state of Virginia in 1994, but he would, despite a vigorous campaign, lose. On May the 10th, 1989, the government of President of Panama, Manuel Noriega, declared void the result of the May the 7th presidential election, which Noriega had lost to Guillermo Endara. On May the 14th, 1989, Carlos Menem was elected as the Argentinian president. On May the 20th, in response to the Tiananmen Square protests, the Chinese government declared martial law in Beijing. From June the 1st to 10th, 1989, Pope John Paul II visited Norway, Iceland, Finland, Denmark, and Sweden. All these 5 Nordic or Scandinavian countries are majority Lutheran countries. It was also considered a major step forward in ecumenism, or the cooperation between different Christian churches and denominations. On June the 2nd, Mr. Sosuke Uno succeeded Noboru Takeshita as the Prime Minister of Japan. On June the 3rd or 4th, the world's first HD TV broadcasts started in Japan in analog. The Tiananmen Square crackdown took place in Beijing on the army's approach to the square, and the final standoff in the square was covered live on television. The Solidarity Trade Union won massively Poland's first partly free parliamentary election since the country had become communist in 1945. It won all the free elected 161 seats out of 460 in the country's lower house of parliament, the same, and 99 of the 100 Senate seats. On June the 5th, 1989, an unknown Chinese protester, the so-called Tank Man, stood in front of a column of military tanks on Chang'an Avenue in Beijing, temporarily halting them, an incident which achieved iconic status internationally through images taken by Western photographers. On June the 15th, 1989, the centre-right ruling party of Ireland, Fianna Fáil, led by Taoiseach or Prime Minister Charles Haughey, failed to win a majority. On July the 5th, 1989, State President of South Africa, Peter Willem Botha, met the imprisoned 70-year-old Nelson Mandela, a black South African lawyer and civil rights activist, face-to-face for the first time. He had been sentenced to life in prison with some other black South African civil rights activists in 1964. From July the 9th to 12th, US President George Bush traveled to Poland and Hungary, pushing for US economic aid and investment. On July the 19th, 1989, the National Assembly of the Republic of Poland elected hardline General Wojciech Jaruzelski to the new and powerful post of President of Poland. On July the 20th, 1989, Burmese opposition leader Mrs. Aung San Suu Kyi was placed under house arrest. She would only be released in 2010. On July the 28th, 1989, at the Iranian presidential election, electors overwhelmingly elected Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani as president of Iran and endorsed changes to the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, increasing the president's powers. However, the president is still, these 30 years later, subordinate to the so-called supreme leader, the highest ranked Islamic cleric of Iran. On August the 2nd, 1989, Pakistan was readmitted to the Commonwealth of Nations after leaving it in 1972. On August the 15th, 1989, following a long, rambling televised address, Peter Willem Botha resigned as the South African president and was replaced by a more moderate member of the National Party, Frederick Willem de Klerk. On August the 19th, Polish President Wojciech Jaruzelski nominated Solidarity activist Mr. Tadeusz Mazowiecki to become prime minister, the first non-communist in power in 42 years. On August the 23rd, 1989, 2 million indigenous people of Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian Soviet Socialist republics joined hands to demand freedom and independence from Soviet occupation, forming an uninterrupted 600-kilometer human chain called the Baltic Way. This was also the 50th anniversary of the so-called Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which, under its secret clauses, included the transfer of those three Baltic countries to the Soviet sphere of influence. Hungary removed border restrictions with Austria. On September the 6th, South Africa held its last whites-only general election, although technically the Coloreds and Indians also could participate. They, however, elected their separate parliamentary chambers. It returned the National Party to power with a much reduced majority. On September the 20th, 1989, Frederick Willem de Klerk was sworn in as the seventh and last state president of South Africa. On October the 1st, 1989, civil union between partners in a same-sex relationship became legal in Denmark, the world's first such legislation. On October the 3rd, a coup attempt was foiled by Manuel Noriega, the military leader of Panama in Central America. The government of East Germany closed the country's border with Czechoslovakia to prevent further emigration to the West. The spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhists, the Dalai Lama, won the Nobel Peace Prize on October the 5th. On October the 7th, the Communist Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party voted to reorganize itself as a socialist party to be named the Hungarian Socialist Party. On October the 9th, 1989, in Leipzig, East Germany, protesters demanded the legalization of opposition groups and democratic reforms. On October the 18th, 1989, the Central Committee of the Socialist Unity Party or Communist Party of East Germany surprisingly voted to remove the aged and hardline East German leader, Mr. Erich Honecker, from office. He was succeeded by a more reformist communist politician, Mr. Egon Krenz. The National Assembly of Hungary voted to restore multi-party democracy. On October the 31st, 1989, the Grand National Assembly of Turkey, or the Parliament, elected Prime Minister Turgut Özal as the 8th President of Turkey. On the same day, 500,000 people demonstrated in the East German city of Leipzig. On November the 1st, 1989, the border between East Germany and Czechoslovakia was reopened. On November the 9th, 1989, Mr. Günther Schabowski, the Communist East German government's official spokesperson, accidentally announced in a press conference that immediately, without a delay, the East Berliners would be allowed to visit freely West Berlin. And also the travel between the two Germanys would become free for the two countries' citizens. On November, or later that November, East Germans would start tearing pieces from the Berlin Wall, which had divided the two halves of Berlin since 1961, and which had been the starkest and most notorious symbol of the Cold War division of Europe. On November the 10th, 1989, after 45 years of communist rule in Bulgaria, southeastern Europe, the Bulgarian communist leader, Mr. Todor Zhivkov, was forced to resign, being replaced by Foreign Minister Petar Mladenov, who changed the party's name to the Bulgarian Socialist Party. On November the 12th, 1989, Brazil held its first free presidential election since 1960. This marked the first time that all Ibero-American nations except Cuba had elected constitutional governments simultaneously. On November the 14th, 1989, elections were held in Namibia in southwestern Africa, leading to a victory for the Southwest Africa People's Organization. On November the 15th, 1989, Mr. Lech Wałęsa, leader of Poland's Solidarity Movement, addressed a joint session of the United States Congress. On November the 17th, 1989, a peaceful student demonstration in Prague, Czechoslovakia, was severely beaten back by riot police. This sparked a revolution aimed at overthrowing the communist government. Because it did not involve any official bloodshed, it was called the Velvet Revolution. And on December the 29th, 1989, the embattled Czechoslovak communist government surrendered power to the pro-democracy movement. On November the 26th, 1989, Luis Alberto Lacalle was elected president of Uruguay in South America. On November the 28th, 1989, the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia announced that it would give up its monopoly on political power. Elections held in December brought the first non-communist government to Czechoslovakia in more than 40 years. On November the 29th, 1989, Rajiv Gandhi resigned as the Indian Prime Minister after his party, the Indian National Congress, lost about half its seats at the 1989 Indian general election. On December the 1st, 1989, the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, met Pope John Paul II and pledged greater religious freedom for citizens of the Soviet Union. On the same day, East Germany's parliament abolished the constitutional provision granting the communist-dominated Socialist Unity Party its monopoly on power. Mr. Egon Krenz, the Politburo and the Central Committee resigned 2 days later. A military coup attempt began in the Philippines against the government of Philippine President Mrs. Corazon Aquino. It was crushed by United States intervention, ending by December the 9th. In the Taiwanese legislative election, the nationalist Kuomintang Party suffered its worst election setback in 40 years, winning only 53% of the popular vote. On December the 3rd, the Malta summit was held off the coast of Malta. US President George Bush and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev released statements indicating that the Cold War between their nations might be coming to an end. On December the 6th, 1989, the École Polytechnique massacre took place in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Mr. Marc Clépine, an anti-feminist gunman, murdered 14 young women at that college. On December the 7th, the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic became the first of the republics of the Soviet Union to abolish the Communist Party's monopoly on power. On December the 9th, the Socialist Unity Party of Germany elected the reformist Mr. Gregor Gysi as party leader. On December the 10th, President of Czechoslovakia, Mr. Gustav Husak, swore in a new cabinet with a non-communist and then immediately resigned as president. Mr. Tsakhiyagin Elbegdorj announced the establishment of Mongolia's democratic movement that peacefully changed the second oldest communist country into a democracy. Mongolia is a sparsely populated, mountainous and extremely cold country in Eastern Asia. On December the 14th, 1989, Chile held its first free election in 16 years, electing Patricio Aylwin as president. On December the 17th, 1989, tulen, only a few minutes. The Romanian Revolution began in Timișoara. Tulen. On December the 21st, 1989, Nicolae Ceausescu addressed an assembly of some 110,000 people outside the Romanian Communist Party's headquarters in Bucharest, but the crowd began to chant against him. On December the 25th, he and his wife Elena were sentenced to death and executed in Tirgoviste. On December the 29th, Václav Havel was elected, the first post-communist president of Czechoslovakia. Okay.